Pablo Escobar once offered to pay off Colombia's entire national debt. El Chapo built a submarine to move cocaine. The Sinaloa Cartel has more military firepower than some governments. And yet, none of them ever truly ran Latin America because there was always a bigger power in the room. And it wasn't in Medellin, it wasn't in Culiacan, it was in Washington, D.C.
Today we are decoding the backyard doctrine, the ancient power strategy the US has used for over 200 years to make sure that Latin America never produces a power strong enough to challenge Washington. We are going to cover three things. 1. How the US destroyed its own allies to prevent a rival from rising. 2. How the DEA became the most powerful geopolitical tool in the Western Hemisphere. And 3. The modern game, why China, Russia, and Iran are now using the exact same playbook the US wrote. To understand what is happening in Latin America today, with Maduro in Venezuela, with the drug cartels, and with the border crisis, you have to go back to 1973. Chile, Salvador Allende was democratically elected. He was, by all accounts, a socialist. He wanted to nationalize Chile's copper mines, mines that were largely owned by American corporations, and Washington had panicked. Not because Allende was threatened militarily, but simply because he was a threat economically. He was providing and proving to Latin America that it could be a country that can choose its own path. And that to Washington was absolutely unacceptable. So the CIA under Nixon and Kissinger orchestrated a coup. So on September 11th, 1973, Allende died in the presidential palace, and General Augusto Pinochet took power. What followed was 17 years of one of the most brutal military dictatorships in Latin America's history. Thousands were tortured, thousands had disappeared, and Washington simply called it stability. But here is the pattern. The moment you remove a legitimate government and replace it with a brutal military regime, you create a power vacuum. And power vacuums don't stay empty, they get filled. In Chile's case, and across the entire region, they got filled by drug cartels. When you destroy legitimate governance, people don't just sit quietly. They find new power structures. And in Latin America, the new power structure wore a gold chain and carried an AK 47. Pablo Escobar didn't rise because Colombians are criminals. He rose because the Colombian state that was weakened, corrupted, and destabilized by decades of US backed military rule that could not provide security, jobs, or justice. Escobar did. He built hospitals. He built housing. He paid people salaries. He was, to the poor people of Medellin, what the government refused to be. And here is where it gets geopolitical. Escobar became so powerful that he threatened to do something no cartel boss has ever done before. He threatened to run for political office. He wanted a seat in the Colombian Congress, and Washington immediately understood the danger. A narco state with nuclear ambitions is one thing. A narco democracy where a drug lord wins a legitimate elections is something else entirely. And that is a direct challenge to the balance of power. The same pattern repeated with El Chapo and the Sinaloa Cartel in Mexico. By the 2000s, the Sinaloa Cartel had more operational reach than the Mexican military had. They had politicians, judges, generals, and police chiefs on their payroll. They were not just a criminal organization, they were a parallel government. And a parallel government, especially one with ties to China's fentanyl supply chain and potential Russian money laundering networks, becomes a geopolitical problem, not just simply a law enforcement one. And this brings us to the most uncomfortable truth of this entire video. The DEA, the Drug Enforcement Administration, was simply never designed to eliminate the drug trade. It was simply designed to manage it. If you think about it strategically, If the US truly wanted to end the drug trade, it would, for all intents and purposes, legalize and regulate. The demand is in America. The supply is in Latin America. The solution is simply economic. But that is not what happened. Instead, the United States built the most powerful drug enforcement agency in the world and simply used it as nothing more than a geopolitical tool. Here is what the historical records show. Not conspiracy theories, but documented fact. The US has repeatedly allowed certain cartels to operate while destroying others. The Sinaloa Cartel for decades appeared to be receiving preferential treatment from US agencies compared to its rival cartels like the Los Zetas or the Gulf Cartel. Why? Because the Sinaloa Cartel was predictable, manageable. They simply kept the peace in their own territory. They didn't behead journalists on camera. They were, in the language of geopolitics, a quote unquote a stable partner. And after 9/11, this dynamic became ever more explicit. The US intelligence agencies needed eyes on the southern border, fast. And the most effective intelligence network on that border was not the FBI or the CIA, it was the Mexican cartels. According to multiple investigative journalists and former DEA agents, there were arrangements made. Information for access, eyes on the border for operational freedom. This was somehow not unique to United States history. It had worked previously with the Italian mafia during World War II in its invasion of Sicily and southern Italy, and including to secure the ports of New York. For power will always find its partners. But here is where the ancient pattern takes a modern twist. The US has run the backyard doctrine for over 200 years. And for most of that time, it had worked, because no one else had the reach or the resources to challenge it. That is simply no longer the case. China has invested over $150 billion in Latin America infrastructure projects in the last decade. They are building ports, roads, and railways. The same way the British East India Company built infrastructure in India before colonizing it. Russia has propped up Venezuela's Maduro's regime before it had been collapsed with oil deals and military advisors. And Iran has used Hezbollah's Latin American networks. Yes, Hezbollah has a presence in the tri-border area of Argentina, Brazil, and Paraguay, to most likely to move money and influence across the region. And the cartels, they are now simply the middlemen. The Sinaloa cartel sources fentanyl precursors from China. The Gulf Cartel has been linked to Iranian money laundering networks, and the US is no longer the only power trying to manage Latin American criminal networks. It is now in a full geopolitical competition, and the battlefield is just simply the drug trade. Which brings us to today. Donald Trump's removal of Nicolas Maduro, or at minimum his aggressive pressure campaign against the Maduro regime, is not about democracy. It is not about human rights. It is always about the same thing it has always has been about. Venezuela sits on the largest proven oil reserves on the planet, larger than Saudi Arabia, and Maduro has been selling that oil to China, Russia, and Iran, cutting Washington out of the equation entirely. Removing Maduro is not just a humanitarian mission, it is a resource reclamation operation, dressed in simply the language of freedom. And here is the ancient pattern. Rome did not conquer Carthage because Carthage was evil. Rome conquered Carthage because Carthage controlled the trade routes of the Mediterranean. The US does not pressure Venezuela because Maduro is a dictator. The US pressures Venezuela because Venezuela's resources are flowing to its rivals. The language changes, but the logic ever does. And this is the lesson that connects every single video that I have posted, the last few videos on this channel. Whether it was the Iran equilibrium, the Korean balance of powers, or today with the narcos of Latin America, the pattern is always the same. The powerful do not fear the criminal. They fear the criminal who becomes too powerful to control. Pablo Escobar was not killed because he sold cocaine. He was killed because he bombed a presidential candidate and declared war on the Colombian state. El Chapo was not extradited because of drug charges. He was extradited because the Sinaloa Cartel had become a parallel government that Washington could no longer manage from the outside. The line is never morality. The line is always about power. The same ancient rule that kept Iran caged, the same rule that keeps Korea divided today, the same rule that destroyed Allende and built Pinochet. No one is allowed to rise too fast. No one is allowed to become too powerful. And the system, whether it wears a suit in Washington or a military uniform in Santiago, it will always find a way to maintain its balance. So the next time you see a headline about Latin America, whether it's about cartels, about regime change, or simply the border crisis, I want you to ask yourself three questions. Question one, who benefits? Not who says they benefit, who actually benefits from this outcome. Question two, what resource or route is being controlled? Every geopolitical conflict has an economic engine underneath it. Find that engine. Question three, what historical pattern does this repeat? Because I promise you, it has happened before. The names change, the flags change, but the pattern does not.
Latin America is not a drug problem. It is a balance of power problem. Cartels are just one part of the story. The story is 200 years of a superpower treating an entire continent as its private resource revenue. And the moment that grip starts to loosen, every rival power on the planet are just trying to fill in the vacuum. And we have seen this before in the Roman provinces of the Roman Empire, in the British colonies, in the Cold War proxy states, and we are also watching it happen all over again right now, the south of the border. If this video gave you some new lens to the world, hit that like button. It takes only 1 second. It can also tell the algorithm that this kind of deep, honest analysis that deserves to be seen. Subscribe to my Chronicles of History because we are trying to build a community of critical thinkers here, not just passive consumers. And if you know someone who's tired of being manipulated by headlines or about the border, cartels, Latin America, share this video with them. And my name is Arjus Fahani, and I'll see you guys in the next chapter.